Okay, everybody, great to see you all. Hope you finish your introductions. You'll get some more time each week around the table to kind of talk. And this is kind of a unique deal because you got the women right across the hall. How many of your wives are here tonight across the hall? Yeah. It feels like we ought to yell something. Like, we are men. Yes, it's true. We are men. How about you? And kind of yell that across the. Maybe not. Yeah, that didn't really work because they're not men, Jonathan. So so we won't be yelling that. Really glad that you're here. We're about to embark on an incredible study. How many of you have ever done biblical manhood before? I know some of you have started it, didn't finish it, but okay, about a third of you guys have done it. Okay, so it's really an incredible time. And we celebrate the idea that God made us men, and it's great to be a man. Because, as men, we know how to fix stuff. As men, we, for a 5-day trip, requires only one suitcase. As opposed to our wives, it would take much more. We can open all of our own jars. We can go to the bathroom without a support group. It's great to be a man. We can leave a motel bed unmade. If someone forgets to invite us to something, they can still be our friend. Underwear is $10 a 3-pack. We can sit quietly and watch a game with a friend for hours without thinking he must be mad at me. We can drop by and see a friend without having to bring a little gift. If another guy shows up at a party in the same outfit, you just might be lifelong friends. And your pals will never trap you with the question, so, notice anything different? So it's great to be a man. Though what we want to start off today is actually talking about, it's great to be a man, but today in our society there's a lot of confusion, isn't there? So as you follow along with your notes, a couple of things that I want to do is, as we launch onto this thing, is give you some really important presuppositions for the study. So there are some things that really that are kind of beginning, presuppositional. These are the truths. These are some of the assumptions that we're making as we kind of move forward about manhood. And I want to kind of give you some pretty quick, and this is all by way of introduction to our study for the whole course. That manhood is in a state of confusion. So we all understand that, when God created man, that there was this operating system that he put into man. It was kind of what we would say a masculine mode of relating, a masculine mode of feelings, a masculine mode of approach to the world. And then somewhere along the way we kind of moved to OS2, which was the idea of more of a feminized approach. And what I mean to that is that God clearly created women with also a unique feminine approach to the world. But along the way, we've kind of gotten to the point where society tells us that one is more important than the other. That the masculinity has somehow been dangerous and been bad and has not gone well. And so men typically mess things up. And so the feminine approach, the feminine operating system, well, that's the better system. And so a lot of that has resulted in confusion and an approach to move men into kind of more of a feminized way of relating. And so you hear things like, have you gotten in touch with your feminine side? Have you guys gotten in touch with your feminine side? I mean, you kind of hear that question and you think, well, what does that mean? Do I have a feminine side? And what does a feminine side mean? And so there are a lot of confusion that just even around that idea. So what does it mean really to be a man? What did God intend? I was reading last week in my quiet time, I read through 1 Kings. And you remember David is dying. And he says to Solomon, he kind of gathers him, and David's on his deathbed. He says, I'm about to go the way of the world, the way of the earth, phrase for death. And he says to Solomon, now gather around me because I want you to show yourself to be a man. I want you to act like a man. And he kind of gives him some exhortation to walk with God, to follow God's commands. Gives him a number of other things, but there was something that was being communicated there. Show yourself to be a man. And in today's culture, when we talked about like be a man, what does that mean anymore? And so sometimes there's just confusion. So You know, here's a slide of Newsweek magazine. This was back in 2010. And we're told here to man up, and the copy on the front cover, I know you probably can't read it. It basically says the traditional male is an endangered species. It's time to rethink masculinity. Now, what they're trying to say is that masculinity, as we traditionally thought about it, is an endangered species. And they're saying, okay, maybe it should go away, or let's lament the fact that it's going away. But they're saying we need to rethink masculinity. That we need to, certainly move to something different than what we've had traditionally. There is, I think that the confusion is reflected in a number of ways. I'll never forget, just kind of one more entertaining kind of idea. But I remember watching one of these Die Hard movies with Bruce Willis. You guys seen this movie? They had a number of these different ones, right? So, Willis plays this John McClane, this NYPD detective. And he goes through all these really rough situations. He comes through traumatic kind of experiences. He fights the bad guys. He gets blown up. He's pushed out windows. He's the tough man, the typical, like this is masculinity. And then, and this is the particular scene where, or I guess the movie was Live Free, Die Hard. But they introduced this other guy, this actor who we all can remember from the IBM, the PC, Mac commercials. You remember this guy? His name's Matt Farrell. And if you saw the movie, he comes alongside Wilson. He's kind of the new kind of guy, because he's grown up like getting by in the world with understanding technology. So he's a hacker. He can figure out things more through technology, not through kind of brute force. He's a little softer. There's one great scene where I think a helicopter chases Willis in through this tunnel. It throws its rotor off, and he's doing all he can to escape it. He just barely survives. He's all bloody, and the guy, the other character, is kind of hiding. He's not in a part of it at all. He kind of runs up to him after all this has died down, and he says, "Hey, are you okay?" And he says, "Yeah." Willis says, "I'm fine." And he turns to this Matt Farrell character, and he says, "Are you okay?" He said, "Well, I scraped my knee a little bit." And there was just this, this huge contrast that they're building between that. And I'm not saying they had an agenda here, but I'm just saying, there is a big difference between kind of the idea of man being strong and tough and entering his world with strength to overcome problems and to accomplish big things versus not that. And one of the presuppositions that I want to challenge is that the traditional idea may not be the biblical idea. In other words, when you think, is it enough that we're just strong, or do we need to be soft? Is it that we really need to be tough, or is there a place for being tender? And there's just a lot to try to sort through on that. But with the confusion in our society, what tends to get elevated more than anything else is this more feminized side, this softer side. We're going to talk a lot more about that. But one of the things I just want to throw at you from the very beginning is that God intended, when He created them male and He created them female, He created male and female, and that both genders represent the image of God, or the image of God is stamped on both genders, and there's something unique that He intended for both. And I would say that even when you just consider the male and female anatomy, that alone is enough to kind of like help you to see like there's a difference here between the two. Like the man was designed to kind of rise up, if you will, in strength and to penetrate his world. And a woman is created as a nurturer to receive and to care and to nurture life. That there are real differences that are physically reflected, but what is spiritually, emotionally true in every other way. So we live in a time where all that's getting blended, and there's this state of confusion. So One of the three things, I'm going to give you three causes for why this has happened, and this will be just a very brief kind of run through, a short sociological, like what's happened in our society that explains kind of the state of confusion. Number one of the reasons is the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so one of the things we remember is that America for so many years was an agricultural society where boys grew up as well as daughters. They were at home. Dad was at home. He worked the fields. He got up early in the morning. His son usually was with him. Perhaps daughters inside, but whatever. They're out working the fields together. Young boy grows up, smelling his dad's sweat, working close to him. They're interacting, like problem solving, doing work, doing the hard things to kind of make life work. Because that's what a young boy just regularly inherited from his dad. With the Industrial Revolution, and dad leaves, goes off into the city to work. That led to isolation. It led into exhaustion. So dad comes back, he leaves early, comes back exhausted. There's not a lot of relational investment in the son and his daughter anymore because there's not that whole length of time. And so, you think about your own growing up in elementary school, and the majority of your teachers were, if not all of them, were all women, and so you spend your time like around women. You were at home, and maybe mom's at home, or mom was there to greet you when you got back, and dad wasn't around as much. A lot of that was just kind of part of the whole industrial revolution that happened. And so, prior to that, it was very different. Now, of course, we're all born post-industrial revolution, so like that doesn't seem that big a deal to you. That's kind of what we grew up with. But for the early 20th century, early 20th century, late 19th century, that's the way it was. And so the Industrial Revolution kind of played havoc with some of that. Number two is that there's a spiritual revolution, and you guys know all about this. Let me just remind you real quick that like in the 1800s and earlier than the 1800s till about 1859 with Darwin's Origin of the Species, that it was considered unintelligible to be an atheist. Like to not believe in God, to not think, okay, like we got here from God and there's a God who exists and who has revealed himself. That was the normal way of thinking. If you believed other than that, you were really looked down upon as unintelligible. But after 1859, and as that grew in popularity, for the first time atheism became more acceptable. And it took a number of decades before it began to creep into the seminaries, before they started embracing the idea that maybe the Bible cannot be trusted, that we got here by different means. And that began to undermine a lot of the faith of our country. And listen, you guys know this, like that has had a huge impact on our world. And specifically when it talks about these kinds of issues about masculinity, femininity, like what God had in mind about marriage, like society, all these kinds of social issues all have foundation in the Bible. Like God has revealed, God has said things to us about these things. But when the Bible began to be undermined, that started playing havoc. And so, you see this old Newsweek, I guess it's a Newsweek cover, about the generation that forgot God. Let's move to, keep going, brother. Spiritual revolution. Here's the generation that forgot God, Time magazine. So they're talking about, this is way back, they're talking about what happened in the 60s and the 70s, that when you started undermining the Bible, and so some of the traditions that were in place that weren't just social mores, or social traditions, they really actually had a biblical foundation. You undermine the Bible, and so then people started like doing different things. And so, men began to leave their wives, and wives began to leave their husbands, and divorce rate skyrocketed, and there was, a complete rejection that began about what God says about morality. And so, you start thinking about what impact has that had in our society. Well, part of this is spiritual revolution. So now you don't know, what is right and what is wrong. And so you try to raise your kids, and in this next magazine cover, you basically ask the question, whose values? Some of you are old enough maybe to remember the old Dan Quayle running as vice president, and Murphy Brown's on TV, and she's single, and she wants to adopt a child. Dan Quayle, during the presidential race, calls that into question, sets off this huge controversy about, okay, well, why can Dan Quayle say that's wrong? Like, whose values get to determine what's right and wrong in our society? And we all appreciate this, right? That if you undermine the Bible, which is the only source that can really speak authoritatively about what is right, what is wrong, what's moral, what's immoral, and you undermine that, then it's just your idea against our idea. And so, we grew up kind of in a relativistic culture. In that, you decide, Jason, what's right for you. I'll decide what's right for me. Jonathan, you decide what's right for you. Like, we may not believe the same thing, but who's to say who's right and who's wrong? And so we have a society like that, and that just plays a lot of havoc with our kids. So in the next magazine cover, it just says, kids, sex, and values. Just do it, just say no, just wear a condom. What's a kid supposed to think? And so a lot of the confusion and lack of clarity with mom and dad just gets passed down to our kids. And so all of this is illustrating that we've come a long way, baby, just in terms of not only social, the industrial revolution, but this whole spiritual revolution. And that plays a lot of havoc with us and with our family. And then, of course, there's the social revolution. Is the third cause that I want to talk about. Social revolution in the 60s and the 70s began in a lot of different ways, but certainly the rise of feminism was a big part of that. And so I think we would all celebrate, some of the elements of feminism, basically, equal pay for equal work. We would all be able to get behind that. But a lot of feminism in its radical beginnings was to really downplay the need for men. I mean, Gloria Steinem famously said, a woman needs a man like a pig needs a bicycle, something to that effect. There was radical things in feminism that I think have mellowed out more today, but there's nevertheless was kind of the sense that, okay, we need to kind of move away from masculinity and we need to elevate femininity, and that resulted in some of the confusion in our society today. And here's one of the presuppositions, or I guess going along with this presupposition, is that all of us coming into this course have an idea, what does it mean to be a man? And there have been a number of different influences on us. Primarily, our own fathers have had the most influence. But in the absence of dad, especially in the absence of dad, culture has become a dominant voice. So whether it's movie, media, music, film, all this has kind of had a huge impact on us. These different societal areas of revolution, I'm calling it social and the industrial, and then this kind of rise of feminism has all contributed to that. Let me give you a couple of quotes here. This is all just to try to illustrate the presence of confusion regarding men and women. What is interesting is that there is kind of this idea that there's no longer real meaningful differences between men and women, which is interesting because in the West here we really elevate science. Science is a big deal to us, and when science actually started turning.
Your chair is in the crack.
My chair's been cracked?
You're in the crack. Part of the chair is, I don't want you to fall over.
Wow, that is a very masculine thing to do right there.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but I saw the way around.
Just kind of entering into the world, for the good of another person. That's a very masculine thing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I just find it so intriguing, this idea that while we really, praise science in the West here, we have fostered this idea that men and women are not different, that they're really the same. Of course, we're moving toward this whole androgynous, genderless kind of approach. But the science, a number of studies that were done, talk about how different men and women are. And yet we fail to really embrace that idea. In fact, I don't know where, oh yeah, here we go. Why are men and women different? The bottom line says, it isn't just upbringing. New studies show they are born that way. What a novel idea. They're actually born that way. And in fact, what they're doing is a number of studies that came out is that they were responding to the belief system that, if you just quit giving, girls little dolls and quit giving boys G.I. Joes, that they really will grow up to kind of be the same thing. It's that we condition them to act in feminine or masculine ways, to act like boys and girls. And so science, a number of social science in particular, released all these different studies that say, hey, no, there are real differences. Nevertheless, the result of all of this is that there is confusion. Okay, let's move to a second presupposition here, that confused men create major problems. Confused men create major problems. So, U.S. News and World Report, I don't think I have that for you here, but a while back, they did a cover magazine called Dad is Destiny, really responding to a number of books that were written during this time. They just talked about the undeniable influence of dads on both their sons and their daughters. And the article basically went on to say that you cannot deny the incredible influence of dad, yet 40% of boys grow up without their dad. 40% of boys grow up without their dad. I wonder if you'd be willing just to say, did you grow up primarily without your dad? Well, how many of us would fit that? Okay, it was late in high school when my dad left, but I grew up mostly with him. Okay, so about 40% is what this is. If you look at the hands, 40% of guys grow up without dad. 40% of boys without dad. True for boys and girls. All that leads to really changing family dynamics. So confused men create major problems. Let me tell you what Garrison Keillor said. Garrison Keillor says, these are not good times for men. Manhood has become more of a problem to overcome than a status to obtain. Now, I don't know if you pick up on that, but if you watch a lot of this situational comedies over the years, just kind of think back on the situational comedies and how the man is generally portrayed. He's generally, kind of a bozo. Like, he doesn't really have answers to the problems. He typically kind of messes things up. That typically, for many years, I think things are mellowing out a little bit, for lack of so that. But for many years, men were really just seen as the problem. And I think that's why Garrison Keillor is saying something like that. Newsweek magazine showed a man with a suit with a face of a pig. Are men really that bad? What are they doing? They're reflecting what society is saying, what media is saying, what entertainment is saying, what is kind of the prevalent view. They're responding to this idea. That's kind of what has been a dominant view. Now, I'm kind of giving you like a brief history, kind of working up to where we are. But there has been that idea. Are men really that bad? Well, when you look at some of the statistics, you kind of find that men can be pretty bad. All right, very quickly, here are some of the stats, that you see. 90% of crimes by men. 100% of rapes. 95% of petty theft crimes, 91% of domestic violence, 94% of DWIs are all men. And part of what this course is going to stress on is that God created us with this masculine energy to do something really constructive, to kind of move into our world and to construct and build In the words of Genesis, it would be, okay, the man and the woman together as a team are going to move and exercise dominion over the world and to rule over the world, which is basically the idea of helping, to populate the earth and to rule over it and to bring about society in a healthy, constructive, profitable way for the purposes of God. And so man's got this energy to want to do that, but when man is not given the route to do that, he uses that energy in a destructive way. I can't remember if it was John Eldridge or what's the guy from Little Rock who did this material? Little Rock, Robert Lewis, thank you. Robert Lewis, who's responsible for the vast majority of this material. Robert Lewis or this other guy, Eldridge, made the idea that man without a king will basically work in a destructive way. If a man has a king who is a good king, he'll lead men to do great and good and noble things. But without a king, or with a bad king, that men will still do big kind of things, but it's usually more destructive. And so when we say that men without a clarity of what it means to be a man, that confused men create problems, I think all of that is illustrative of that. The statistics show that. Margaret Mead, distinguished anthropologist, years ago wrote this: the central problem of every society is to define appropriate roles for men. You mean it's not to, to find a good water source? It's not to find out how we're going to educate the kids. So studying societies throughout the ages around the world, she says this is the chief issue. And so then, if that is true, if you accept that idea, and then if you kind of see, as I do, that the kind of confusion that's out there about masculinity, man, you just see a train wreck here. Okay. Men are not neutral. Okay, let me just, I know you don't need more evidence, but let me just read you a little bit. There were a number of books and articles about the trouble with boys, and I think I've got some of this, The Boy Crisis, Music Magazine. There's a book that follows here, The Trouble with Boys. I just want to read you just a little bit from, let's see if I brought it in here, This Trouble with Boys. They argue that, this is from a Newsweek magazine, this was back in 2006, it says, one of the most reliable predictors of whether a boy will succeed or fail in high school rests on a single question: does he have a man in his life to look up to? I just think that is so profound. The single most influential factor is that does he have a man to look up to? Which, by the way, gentlemen, that's why my dream is that our children's ministry would be actually flooded with men. I wish that in every classroom that we had one or two men in there. That these kids who are coming in to learn about Jesus, that they see that real men love Jesus. That masculinity is on display. Because we love and interact in a different way. It's not like our way is better than the way women relate. Both are highly, highly important. But when men are removed from any kind of context with children because, hey, we don't do kids, I think we just contribute to part of the problem here. So anyway, he goes on to say this. He says, too often the answer is no. High rates of divorce, single motherhood have created a generation of fatherless boys in every kind of neighborhood, rich or poor. An increasing number of boys, now a startling 40%, are being raised without their biological dads. Psychologists say that grandfathers and uncles can help, but emphasize that an adolescent boy without a father figure is like an explorer without a map. He's like an explorer without a map. It's like, okay, you just kind of turn out into the world and you just try to figure this thing out. And there's no one really there to guide you. Let me just skip down here a little bit. In the past, boys had many opportunities to learn from older men. In neighborhoods where fathers are more scarce, the high school dropout rates are shocking. They just go on to give more stats related to this. Again, further proof, I'm preaching to the choir. I know you guys understand this. We have to understand this is the world where we are. This is the world our boys are growing up in. Okay, confused men create major problems. All right, let me introduce you to a couple of concepts. Number one is that confused men is the third presupposition. Confused men settle for less. Confused men settle for less. Okay, here's two concepts. One is conventional manhood. Conventional manhood is the idea that men are one-dimensional. Like we're just kind of career-driven, like careerism. Conventional manhood is that my value is determined by what I do, and subsequently how much money I make and what kind of lifestyle I live. But primarily my career. Like my value, the way I contribute to the world is primarily the work that I do. That's conventional manhood. A second term, and we'll talk about that more, but the second term is delayed manhood. And so, you know, we laugh a lot about this now, how men who now make their way through college, that, you know, instead of like getting your job and getting married and moving on to society, it's basically, you delay it. And so, you know, you may spend a couple of years, you know, mom and dad put you through college, and now they're going to like pay for a year or two to find yourself, and, you know, you tour Europe, or you move back home, and mom and dad keep paying your insurance bill, and you just kind of hang out for a while. The whole, you know, failure to launch kind of syndrome. So men are putting off getting married a lot later, really getting their job. It's a whole different kind of mindset than what Tom Brokaw called, you know, the greatest generation. You know, the builders generation that finished after World War II and came back home and built society and raised families and, you know, gave birth to the boomers. So the builders, it was the idea of almost all work and no play. The boomers, it was kind of work and play. You know, part of the jab against millennials is that it's just work to play. You know, I'll just work in order to kind of enjoy life. And so you find kind of trends sometimes that develop over the years that you can see. But confused men settle for less. We have delayed manhood. There's this gap. There's failure to launch. So you've got guys who basically come home and they will spend hours and hours and hours doing video games, you know, and getting their score good for Warcraft 2 or whatever the latest hits are. And, you know, wives kind of come and say, hey, can you help me? Like, my husband doesn't, he just comes home and he just does video games all night. And like, there's this idea of play. There's this idea of like, man, I exist just to kind of to seek entertainment. Now, when you do something like this, you know, you're talking in generalisms. You're talking about patterns. There's obviously exceptions, right? We all, you know, maybe we're the exceptions in here, but that's a real pattern. It's a real trend that many men live that way, and it is kind of settling for less. So we'll talk more about those two terms: conventional manhood, delayed manhood. D, there's no lofty vision, is the fourth presupposition here. There's no lofty vision of manhood that is compelling to men today. A term that you'll hear is the idea of developing and passing on a transcendent cause. There's something really big to life, more than just, you know, going to work and, you know, providing for the family. There is a transcendent cause that God has given us. You put eternity in the hearts of men, Ecclesiastes, and that there is this big overarching thing that God calls us to do. And so do we have a sense of that? That's part of biblical manhood. And do we know how to pass that on, that idea of transcendent cause? I want to show you a quote that I think is so sad. This is, I think this is Rollo May, if I remember it. He writes this about men. He says, the clearest picture of the empty life is the suburban man gets up at the same hour each week, morning, takes the same train to work in the city, performs the same task at the office, lunches at the same place, leaving the same tip of the waitress, comes home on the same train every night, spends the same 2 weeks vacationing at the shores, which he does not enjoy, goes to church every Christmas and Easter but does not know why, moves through a mechanical routine existence year after year until he finally retires at age 65 and very soon thereafter dies of heart failure, possibly brought on by repressed hostilities, but I have always had a secret suspicion, however, that he dies of boredom. No lofty, compelling vision for life. So we're going to talk about that God had something very, very different. So we'll talk about how when God created man, that he breathed into the nostrils of man, and the Spirit of God entered into his work. He's looking up at God. By the time that the fall happens in Genesis 3, man's looking down to the ground. He says, from dust to dust, from ash, like you're going to return to the ground. The ground's been cursed, and now he's just working the soil that no longer cooperates with him. That there's no longer this transcendent deal, but we're kind of consumed with just surviving. All right, really uplifting kind of image, I know. Okay, no longer any lofty vision. And 5, here's the last presupposition, is that the Bible has insight and answers to all the above. It has insight and answers to all the above. Now, in this course, you'll find that we definitely are going to develop a biblical manhood, a vision for manhood. There's not really a book in the Bible that's devoted to manhood. It's like it's all turned to the book of manhood. And so we will from time to time reference and draw out principles from the Word of God. But this isn't your typical Bible study where we're going to take a book of the Bible and go through it verse by verse. But let me introduce you to our first verse in 1 Corinthians 13. You say, 1 Corinthians 13, isn't that chapter about love? Is that a masculine chapter? Well, tucked away in this, in verse 11, Paul says this. Chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, and I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. And when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. And so we get some insight. Paul's using this as an illustration for our own spiritual development, spiritual maturity, and when we finally get to go to be with the Lord, how we'll change. But it's insightful that he uses this analogy. He says, look, there's a time when you're a child, and there's a time when you put childhood away, you're a man. And so, especially with the whole delayed, failed to launch, the delayed manhood, this is more and more delayed. This idea that there really is a time where young boys become men. In most societies around the world, there are times when there is a defined moment, usually an event that marks the transition from boyhood into manhood. Famously the Jewish bar mitzvah, where you kind of get to the point where now we all recognize that so-and-so is of this age, and that now he's going to be taking on responsibility and moving to be a man. But in our society, we've never really had that. And so Robert Lewis does a book called Raised in a Modern Day Night. We'll talk about that, the idea of building events that mark progress in your son's life, where that kind of mark his movement from boyhood to manhood. We'll talk about that. The Bible has insights and answers to all the above. And so we'll be looking at a couple of different passages there. And then let me wrap down with a couple of the things here. Roman numeral 2. Manhood develops as we address 2 things. Manhood develops as we address, first, the unfinished business of our past. The unfinished business of our past. Now this is probably the section that we're about to enter. Possibly the hardest part of the course for many of us, but really the most helpful. Because we're going to talk about what influence did Dad have in your life? Sometimes there are things that are really broken between your relationship and your dad's relationship. Things that God may lead you to want to kind of address and pursue some healing in that. And to evaluate like what kind of impact did that have in your life. Sometimes the unfinished business of the past could have been relationship with mom too. So there's a number of different just relationships that have influenced you that you need to kind of think about. Like what lessons in life, what conclusions about life did I draw from my background, the way that I was raised? There's a place for great insight. Sometimes what you'll discover is nothing that amounts to a nuclear explosion, and it's not like huge things. Sometimes it's just the nuclear waste barrels. You know, the canisters where they store nuclear waste and they bury them deep in the ground. And over years and years they start seeping and get to the ground and they start causing problems. And so sometimes like taking a look. So all that's kind of what we'll be doing first. The first third of the course, almost the first quarter, or the first quarter, almost the first third, sorry, kind of deals with like just deconstructing what influenced your present model of manhood. Like how did you arrive where you are? And so if you're like me, when you approach a problem, like there's some kind of issue in life and you think about how am I going to handle this, I still at 59 years old will default to say, what would my dad do in this? And my dad actually set a pretty good example in terms of like he had this saying of saying, hey, you just learn to play the cards you're dealt with. Like you don't need to spend a lot of time like moping around, like, man, why did this happen to me? Or what am I going to do about it? He just said, you learn to play the cards you're dealt with. Now, my dad didn't know Jesus when he was in my home. And he came to know Christ a few years ago here, but that was just still a way that he passed on to me. And so I think about that a lot. For a lot of you, where Dad was at home, there were things that he said and did model, and some of them were really, really good and outstanding. Some of them weren't very good. And so we'll take a look at that. We'll take a look at your relationship with mom, take a look at your relationship with like just friendships, mentors, just kind of put together and try to deconstruct actually those things. So then we can start constructing what manhood is all about from the Bible as we move forward. So that's where we're going. So let me leave you with this slide here. I can't believe that Levi's put this ad out. This is at the very end. So I guess doctors I was thinking Levi. I don't know if you guys ever saw this ad, but listen to what they wrote. This was in print, this was in magazines, different places where they ran this ad. It says, once upon a time, men wore the pants and wore them well. Women rarely had to open doors, and little old ladies never crossed the street alone. Men took charge because that's what they did. But somewhere along the way, the world decided it no longer needed men. Disco by disco, latte by foamy non-fat latte. Men were stripped of their khakis and left stranded on the road between boyhood and androgyny. But today, there are questions our genderless society has no answers for. The world sits by idly as cities crumble, children misbehave, and these little old ladies remain one side of the street. For the first time since bad guys, we need heroes. We need grown-ups. We need men to put down the plastic fork, step away from the salad bar, and untie the world from the tracks of complacency. It's time to get your hands dirty. It's time to answer the call of manhood. It's time to wear the pants. Let's pray. Father, as we give thought to this whole area, I pray that you would motivate these men to want to re-examine even what's currently they're thinking about manhood. I pray, Lord, that because of the confusion in our society, that we would commit to learn a biblical manhood, a biblical definition that will guide us through all the life stages that we're moving through. So no matter if we're young, unmarried, we're young adult, just married, married with kids, married with teenagers, empty nesters, in the last phase of our life, Lord, no matter what life stage, that you would teach us a definition of manhood that would guide us through these things. One that we could pass on to our sons and daughters. That our men can grow up as men and that our daughters can know what kind of man that she's looking for as she moves into her adulthood. And Lord, I pray that you would make that happen. And so tonight, after this first night, would you just give men a vision for what this course could be and how helpful it could be. And I thank you for their commitment to be here. And we pray now as we kind of give some time to this discussion that you would make it fruitful. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.